You've met someone like this before, maybe once, maybe you're still thinking about them. They didn't perform strength. They didn't soften themselves to make you comfortable. They held you with something that felt like precision and warmth at the same time. Like being seen by someone who had no reason to be gentle with you, but chose to be anyway. You couldn't quite categorize them. Not cold, not warm, not hard, not yielding. Something else, something that made you feel for once entirely real. You've probably called it chemistry, magnetism, presence. Those words are true enough, but they don't explain the mechanism. They don't explain why certain people produce that specific sensation of being encountered by someone who is completely themselves. Psychology has a name for what you encountered, and before I give it to you, I want to be precise about something. When I say greatness here, I don't mean fame, I don't mean achievement, dominance, or the kind of success that gets catalogued in biographies. I mean something rarer and harder to fake, the specific psychic force of a fully integrated personality. The capacity to be present without performance, to act from a center that doesn't shift depending on the room. That kind of greatness has a structure, and that structure has always been androgynous. In Plato's Symposium, the comedian Aristophanes tells a story. Humans were originally spherical, whole complete, rolling through the world on 4 hands and 4 feet. They were so powerful, so self-sufficient, that the gods felt threatened. So Zeus split them in half, and ever since, each half has been wandering the earth, searching for the other. This story is almost always told as a romance, as proof that love is destiny, that somewhere out there is your missing piece. But read it again. What Aristophanes is actually describing is a catastrophe, a severing, a violence done to human wholeness by a threatened authority, and the longing that drives the most devastating love, that consuming, disorienting hunger, is not proof of love's greatness. It is the scar tissue of an amputation. The sphere wasn't split into masculine and feminine. It was split into self and self. What we call romantic longing is, very often, psychic incompletion mistaken for destiny. Every society runs a version of the same surgery. It begins before language, before you have the words to resist. Boys are trained to excise a specific set of capacities: receptivity, emotional permeability, the ability to be moved without immediately converting that movement into action. What gets cut is not weakness. What gets cut is the capacity to receive, to be affected, to let something land. Girls are trained to excise a different set authority, claim the right to act from desire rather than response. What gets cut is not aggression. What gets cut is the capacity to assert without apology, to be a force that doesn't first ask for permission. The cuts are clean. That is what makes them so hard to see. By adulthood, most people are walking around with a fully developed half-self functional, articulate, capable of love in the way that an amputee is capable of walking, adapted, compensating, and quietly in pain in ways they've learned not to mention. Jung named what was severed Anima, the feminine soul living in the unconscious of men. Animus, the masculine spirit living in the unconscious of women. He wasn't being poetic. He was making a clinical observation. The cut doesn't kill what it removes. It drives it underground. And what lives underground doesn't stay inert. It becomes autonomous. And what becomes autonomous doesn't stay inside. It attaches itself to figures in the outside world. It waits there, it accumulates pressure, and it returns not as itself, but as projection. The person you fall most catastrophically in love with is not, primarily, a person. They are a walking image of your own unlived interior. Projection is not admiration. It is unconscious outsourcing. You assign another person the burden of carrying what your own personality was never allowed to keep. The man who falls for a woman of oceanic emotional depth, who describes her as mysterious, unknowable, dangerous, is not encountering a stranger. He is encountering his own anima, wearing someone else's face. The qualities that magnetize him are the qualities he had to sever in himself at 7 years old on a playground. When someone told him that feelings were for women, he doesn't recognize them as his own. He can't. They've been gone too long. So he experiences them as hers, as something external, rare, irreplaceable. This is why when she leaves, it feels like a death because it is one. The woman who falls for a man of absolute certainty, who finds his authority intoxicating, who orbits his conviction like a planet, is not encountering strength from outside herself. She is encountering her own animus in exile, the capacity that was trained out of her. The part of her that learned to apologize before it spoke, to wait before it acted, to want only what it had already been given permission to want. When he makes the decisions, it doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like relief, because he is carrying the part of her that was never allowed to exist. Fromm observed that mature love requires the internalization of two distinct logics. Maternal love, unconditional, grounding, the love that says you exist, therefore you are held, and paternal love, conditional, directional, the love that says you are capable, therefore I respect you. Not one or the other, both. Simultaneously, from within, most people have one and are hunting for the other in external form, which is why they find it, briefly, intensely, in another person, and why the loss of that person feels not just like heartbreak, but like structural collapse. You weren't only losing someone you loved, you were losing the half of yourself you'd been renting from them. Here is what Jung did not soften: individuation. The process of becoming whole is not a comfortable experience. It is not a retreat. It is not the pleasant version of self-discovery. To integrate your anima or animus, you must first face it. And what you find when you go looking for the severed half of yourself is not only an undeveloped gift, it is everything you have spent your life fearing, performing the opposite of, and in many cases quietly despising in others. The man who built his identity on composure will find in his anima a chaos he cannot contain, a grief with no object, a tenderness that has never had permission to exist. The woman who built her identity on accommodation will find in her animus a rage that does not ask for approval, a will that does not bend, a voice that does not modulate itself for the comfort of the room. But the cost doesn't stop there. Your existing personality, the one that has been functional, socially rewarded, stable, was built around the missing half. It was constructed specifically to compensate for it, which means that when you begin to integrate what was cut off, the old structure doesn't just expand. It starts to crack. You will lose things you were attached to, the self-image that earned you love in your family of origin, the way of moving through the world that people called dependable or strong or easy to be around, the relationships that depended on you staying exactly as incomplete as you were. Integration is not addition, it is also demolition. Virginia Woolf wrote that the great mind must be androgynous, that any mind which is only masculine or only feminine is, at some level, incomplete, lacking in transmission, incapable of the full range of creative or intellectual reception. She wasn't describing a goal, she was describing an observation. The writers, thinkers, and artists who could genuinely move something in others were the ones who had survived their socialization with some wholeness intact, or had fought their way back to it. That fight is not metaphorical, and most people, when they encounter it, turn back. There is a confusion worth correcting. Androgyny, in the psychological sense, is not balance. It is not a 50-50 distribution of traits. It is not the softening of masculine edges or the deliberate cultivation of feminine ones. It is not, God help us, a personality score. Balance is a managed arrangement between parts that remain separate. Wholeness is what happens when the division stops making sense. The people you cannot forget, the ones who feel unusually, almost threateningly alive, are not performing both sides of a gender binary. They are not strategically warm and strategically firm. They are not code switching between registers. They have reached a point where those registers collapsed into each other. When they hold you, there is weight and gentleness in the same gesture. There is authority and openness in the same sentence, not because they have achieved some ideal, but because they are no longer at war with themselves. The energy that other people spend on internal suppression is in them, simply present, available. Turned outward, that is what you felt. Not balance, not performance. The specific gravity of a personality that stopped fighting itself. The sphere in Plato's story was never meant to be split, but Zeus split it anyway, and we have spent every century since mistaking the ache of that severing for something cosmic, for fate, for the proof that someone out there will complete us. What the great souls across history demonstrated before psychology had the vocabulary to describe it is something harder and less romantic. The missing half is not outside you. It never was. It is the part that was taken. The part that went underground when the world made clear that you were only allowed to be one thing. The part you have been projecting onto the people you fall for, renting from them at the cost of genuine intimacy, mistaking their presence for completion. Individuation is not a journey toward someone. It is a long and often brutal excavation of everything you were told to leave behind. Most people will not make that journey. It is easier. and in some ways less painful, to keep outsourcing, to keep finding, losing, and grieving the external image of an interior they never reclaimed. But the ones who do, you've met one. You remember exactly what it felt like. That is the data point.